I built this box 7 years ago, and I keep it in my shop because I believe it may be the only one like it in the world. I don't think anyone has built anything quite like it, certainly not in the way that I did, because I had to develop new methods to even make this possible. What makes it so unique is the joinery at the corners. It might not look like much, but these joints can't be disassembled or even assembled without breaking up the side panels and therefore destroying the box itself. I call these corners impossible dovetail joints, and they contain a secret that is sort of mind-bending when you first see the box and fascinating if you just take the time to understand what's going on here. So let me explain. This is a typical dovetail joint. On one side, you have a series of tabs that are shaped like a dove's tail, which is where the joint gets its name. Now, the sloping sides of these fit into a set of angled pins on the other half of the joint. So this will only go together in one direction, and it can only come apart in that same direction. You can't pull it apart the other way because the mating slopes prevent it from coming apart. But look at the corner of the box. I don't know if you can see it very well, but the tabs are sloped like the dovetails on both sides. I'd love to take it apart to show you how it works, but you can't take it apart. It may be the strongest box ever made as far as joinery is concerned, but what makes it resist that disassembly also makes it impossible to assemble in the first place, at least not in the conventional way. The secret goes back centuries when you may have found this type of joinery not in cabinet shops, but outside in the forests of rural America, because this type of joinery was used to build log cabins and other structures primarily by German immigrants here in the US. Some of these buildings still survive hundreds of years later because the joints are not only very strong, but they resist rot, since every surface within the joint slopes downward, and that makes the water run out instead of staying up inside. Years ago, I saw one of these buildings, and I always wanted to make a box using the same unique joinery. But I found that building a box is not the same as assembling logs into a cabin. I had to develop entirely new methods to even make it possible, and I think you're going to enjoy watching how I did it. For the joint to work, each dovetail must be cut at a compound angle. Now, the angles of the face of each tail have to match the angles on the ends of each tail. And all these angles have to be consistent throughout the joint. So I made this pattern to lay out my tails. The width of the pattern is equal to the width of the strips that will make up each side of the box. That's right, this box cannot be assembled without breaking up the sides into strips so they can be put together like logs in a cabin wall. But unlike rough-hewn log walls where gaps can just be packed with mud and hog's hair, all of my strips have to fit together perfectly so they'll reform seamlessly into solid panels again when the box is assembled. So that means the width of the strips have to be carefully calculated in their thickness, their width, their length, and the angles of the dovetails. So I did all the math and I created some drawings that you can copy if you like. You can use these dimensions to create patterns for 4 different material thicknesses depending on what you have on hand. But this is only a guide. You may have to tweak your pattern a little bit, especially if your stock is not exactly 1/4, 3/8, 1/2 inch, or 3/4 inch thick. Now, after my pattern was dialed in, I cut my 4 box sides into strips of the appropriate width, marking them with triangles so that I could keep everything in order just as they originally were in the solid boards, because I want the grain to all line back up when I assemble it later so it still looks like solid sides. Next, I used the pattern to lay out my dovetails on what would be the outer faces of each strip. Then I used one of the strips to mark the shoulder on both sides. I repeated this process on each end of each strip, drawing the dovetail shape on what will be the outer face in the assembled box and a shoulder line on both faces. Now you may be wondering how I cut compound angles with just a 2-dimensional pattern. Well, I used a simple jig. This ramp was built at the same angle that I used for the sides of my dovetails. In fact, I actually made the ramp first, then I used the bevel gauge to transfer that angle to my dovetail pattern so they would match precisely. The ramp works with a bandsaw. It helps if you have a fence to keep it square to the table as you cut. I started with the ramp sloping downward from left to right as I was facing the saw. Then I cut a kerf on just the right side of each dovetail. I cut carefully, leaving my pencil line intact, and I repeated the same cut on each end of each strip of wood. With that finished, I rotated the ramp 180 degrees so it sloped from right to left downward, and I repeated the process. Only this time I cut just on the left side, leaving my pencil lines intact. After I did this on both ends of each strip, I rotated the ramp 90 degrees so now it sloped downward toward me, and I slid it up beside the blade so I could cut my shoulder lines. But before I began to cut, I looked at the end of each workpiece to make sure that the angle drawn on the end of the dovetail was parallel to the saw blade. I didn't want the blade to cut into the wide portion of the dovetail as I cut those shoulders. It helped to keep all the strips oriented in the same direction, keeping track of what will be the inner and what will be the outer faces of the assembled box. If I hadn't marked those faces with those triangles at the beginning, I still could identify them by just looking at the ends of the dovetails. The wider face of the dovetail is the inner surface of each strip, and that's the face I wanted facing upward as I cut the shoulder lines with my ramp sloping toward me. Now, as before, I was only cutting on one side of each dovetail, repeating the same cut on each end of each strip. Then I rotated the ramp 180 degrees so it sloped away from me, and I cut the shoulders on the other side of each dovetail. For that side, I also had to flip the strips over, placing the outer faces of the strips upward on the ramp. Back at the bench, I laid out my strips using the triangles I had previously drawn as a reference. I knew the box would be a lot easier to assemble if I cut slots for splines in all of the edge joints, so I used a pencil to mark where those slots would be located. Then I cut them on the table saw as deeply as possible without the blade cutting into the end of the dovetails. As I cut each slot, I also made sure the outer face of each strip was against my table saw fence. Then I just ripped some splines from the same pine I was making the box out of. Next, I selected the two long strips that will be on the bottom of the sides of the boxes and the two short strips that will be on the top of each end of the box, and I ripped them exactly in half. You'll see why shortly. I also took all four strips that will be on the bottom of the box, and I rotated a 1/4 inch groove into them for a bottom panel. Now note how the two long strips, which were the ones I ripped in half, stopped with the grooves just short of the ends, while the two short strips, I cut the grooves all the way down their length. I used a solid panel for this bottom, but I had to bevel the edges with a plane so that they were thin enough to fit into those 1/4 inch grooves. To begin assembling the pieces, I put glue only on the dovetails. I didn't glue the bottom panel into its slots. Instead, I slid it deeply into the slot on one end of the box so I could get the end strip in place. Then I worked it back with my fingers so it was floating in all four slots. That way it can move a bit as it swells and shrinks with humidity changes. The rest of the assembly was pretty easy. I just built it upward like a log cabin. The splines were glued in the edge joints, and the dovetails were glued on the ends as I moved from one layer to the next. I do admit that this was the second time I was assembling it. I did it dry without glue first, so I could look for gaps between my strips, and then I could adjust those by shaving a little bit off the width of the dovetails. This is just as a log cabin was built. Each log may have been placed and removed and replaced and removed several times until the right fit was achieved. And building a box like this takes equal patience, I think. Of course, clamps can be used to squeeze closed any small gaps as the glue dries. And if that doesn't work, you can always add some glue and sawdust for filler and they will all but disappear. It was a difficult build, but I thought a really rewarding challenge. And in the 7 years since I made it, it's been a conversation piece about history, log cabins, and seemingly impossible joinery. Now check this out. This changed my table saw. I'm not kidding. It made my small job site saw so much safer and easier to use. My rip cuts became crisper and straighter. It became easier to cut lumber of all sorts, including sheet goods. I no longer have to worry about work pieces flipping up at the end of the cut. My dados and grooves and other joinery are more accurate, and most importantly, I'm far less worried about getting a dangerous kickback. All of these benefits came from a single attachment that pops on and off with ease. It's called the Bow Extender Fence System, and it's made by a pair of entrepreneurs named Keith Bow and Bill Fadali. This fence system takes compact table saws and even bandsaws to levels I have never seen before. It's based around a thick, durable, precisely straight aluminum extrusion. Now I have a significantly longer reference surface to guide my cut. This makes longer rips much easier to manage, and it really helps guide my sheet goods, which are notoriously difficult to cut on a short fence. You can also adjust the extrusion if you want more guidance on the infeed side or the outfeed side. And you can even position it like a European fence so it ends just ahead of the center of the blade and gives your crappy construction lumber some relief to avoid blade pinches and potential kickbacks. But it gets even better when you add the optional stock supports to the bottom. Now, large and long workpieces are much easier to manage without the need for a large outfeed table or roller stands. It's the perfect portable solution, fully adjustable for whatever your needs are, wherever your needs may take you. This may be the single biggest upgrade I have ever made to a small saw. It ends most of my frustrations, and it makes me feel like I'm back in the shop with my larger cabinet saw. My cuts are easier, they're more accurate, and they're safer. I don't think I'm ever going to use my contractor saw without this again. I really think the Bow Extender Fence System is worth checking into for your table saw or bandsaw. Use the link below this video and check out the Bow Extender Fence System for yourselves.